The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like 1,000 angry spirits, and Helena Turner pressed her swollen belly with trembling hands as another shiver racked her body. She had been a wife just 3 months ago, with a husband who promised her a home in the Nebraska wilderness. But Thomas had been trampled by spooked cattle during a storm, leaving her alone in this decrepit shelter that barely kept out the November cold of 1878. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges. One wall had a gaping hole where the chinking had fallen away, and the roof leaked in 4 different places. But it was all she had left in this unforgiving world. Helena pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. The fire in the small stone hearth had dwindled to embers because she had run out of dry wood 2 hours ago, and venturing outside in her condition seemed like inviting death itself. She was 6 months along, her belly prominent beneath her worn calico dress, and every movement felt like a burden. The baby kicked against her ribs, a reminder that she was not entirely alone, but also a reminder of the responsibility that weighed heavier than any physical load. She had been in Wood River, Nebraska, for only 4 months. Thomas had brought her here from St. Louis with grand dreams of cattle ranching and building an empire on the frontier. They had purchased this land from a settler heading back east, a man who had grown tired of fighting the elements and the isolation. The cabin had been in poor condition even then, but Thomas had promised to fix it up, to make it a proper home. He had started with good intentions, replacing a few boards here and there, but then the work had called him away. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and there was always something more urgent than the cabin repairs. Then came that terrible day when the neighboring rancher rode up with his hat in his hands and told her that Thomas had been caught in a stampede. They brought his body back wrapped in canvas, and Helena had stood there in shock, unable to process that her husband of barely a year was gone. The other ranchers and their wives had been kind in the immediate aftermath, bringing food and offering condolences, but frontier life was hard for everyone. They had their own struggles, their own families to feed, and the visits had grown less frequent as the weeks passed. Now Helena was alone with a baby coming and winter approaching fast. She had a little money saved, but not enough to get back to St. Louis, and even if she could afford passage, what would she do there? Her parents had died from cholera 2 years ago, and she had no siblings. Thomas had been her only family, and now there was just the child growing inside her. The wind gusted again, and Helena heard something crack outside. She closed her eyes and prayed it was not another piece of the cabin falling apart. The sound of hoofbeats made her eyes snap open. Visitors were rare this far from town, and her heart hammered with sudden fear. She struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the rough wooden wall for support. Through the gap in the wall, she could see a rider approaching on a large bay horse. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy canvas duster, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. Helena's breath caught in her throat. She had no weapon except a small knife Thomas had left her for cutting vegetables, and she doubted it would be much use against a man with ill intentions. The rider dismounted with easy grace and tied his horse to the hitching post that leaned at a precarious angle. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and moved with the confidence of someone who knew how to handle himself. As he approached the cabin, Helena pressed herself against the wall beside the door, clutching her knife with white-knuckled fingers. A knock came, firm but not aggressive. "Hello in there," a deep voice called. "Name's Yates Norwood. I'm passing through and saw your chimney smoke. Thought I'd check if anyone needed help." Helena hesitated. His voice sounded genuine without the rough edge that might signal danger, but she had learned to be cautious. "I'm managing fine," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. There was a pause. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude, but that door looks like it's about to fall off, and I can see daylight through your walls from here. With winter coming on, this place won't hold up to a real storm." He was right, but Helena's pride bristled. "I appreciate your concern, but I can handle my own affairs." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, madam, I'm sure you can, but I've got some tools in my pack and some time before I need to be anywhere. If you'll allow it, I'd like to make a few repairs." "No charge, just trying to be neighborly." Helena bit her lip. Her instinct was to refuse, to maintain her independence and not accept charity from a stranger, but the practical part of her mind knew she was in no position to turn down help. The cabin was falling apart around her, and she had neither the skills nor the strength to fix it herself. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked through the door. "My mama raised me to help folks when I can," the man replied, "and I've got 2 sisters back in Texas. I'd hope someone would do the same for them if they needed it." Something in the way he mentioned his mother and sisters eased Helena's fear slightly. She took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, keeping the knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. The man standing on her crooked porch was younger than she had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, clear and direct, and when he saw her condition, his expression shifted to something gentler. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair that needed a trim, "I promise I mean you no harm. I just want to help." Helena studied him for a long moment. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed from hard use but well maintained. He had the look of a working cowboy, someone who earned his living through honest labor. She made a decision that was either wise or foolish, but she was too tired and cold to overthink it. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Yates Norwood nodded and put his hat back on. "First thing we need is to get you warmed up. You look half frozen." "I'll gather some firewood and get that fire built up. Then we'll see about the rest." He turned and walked back to his horse, pulling a hatchet from his saddlebag along with a coil of rope. Helena watched as he surveyed the area around her cabin, then headed toward a stand of cottonwood trees about 200 yards away. She closed the door and sank back down onto her stool, her legs shaking from the brief exchange. For the next hour, Helena listened to the sounds of work outside. The steady rhythm of the hatchet biting into wood, the crack of branches breaking, the occasional grunt of effort. Yates made several trips, each time stacking an armload of wood on the porch. When he finally knocked again, Helena opened the door to find a substantial pile of firewood and the cowboy standing there with kindling in his hands. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the hearth. Helena stepped aside, and he entered the cabin. She saw him take in the state of the interior with a single sweeping glance. The sagging roof beam, the hole in the wall, the meager furnishings, the empty shelves. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knelt by the hearth and began building up the fire with practiced efficiency, arranging the kindling and larger pieces in a way that would produce maximum heat. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, and blessed warmth began to spread through the small space. Helena felt tears prick her eyes at the simple comfort of it. "Thank you," she whispered. Yates stood and brushed bark from his hands. "You're welcome, Mrs." He paused, waiting for her to provide her name. "Turner, Helena Turner." "Mrs. Turner." He nodded respectfully. "Now, with your permission, I'd like to start on that wall. The hole there is letting in cold air that the fire can't compete with." Helena nodded, too grateful to protest. She settled back onto her stool near the fire and watched as this stranger began working to save her life, because that was what it amounted to. Without proper shelter, she and her baby would not survive the Nebraska winter. Yates went back outside and returned with his saddlebags slung over his shoulder. From them, he produced tools that looked well used but carefully maintained. A hammer, nails, a small saw, and strips of leather. He examined the wall with the critical eye of someone who understood construction, running his hands over the remaining chinking and testing the soundness of the logs. "When was this cabin built?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. The man we bought it from said he'd been here 3 years. Yates nodded. "The chinking's all wrong. He used mud without enough straw or grass mixed in. It dried out and fell away. I can fix it properly, but it'll take some time." "I don't want to keep you from wherever you're going," Helena said, though her heart ached at the thought of him leaving before the work was done. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "I was heading to Cheyenne to find work for the winter, but there's no urgency. Another few days won't matter." "Days?" Helena's eyes widened. "I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering." His tone was firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Turner, I can see you're in a difficult situation and I've got the skills to help. It wouldn't sit right with me to ride away knowing you're trying to survive winter in a cabin that's falling down around you." Helena felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had been alone and frightened for so long that this simple act of kindness threatened to undo her completely. She blinked rapidly and looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. Yates seemed to sense her distress and turned his attention back to the wall, giving her a moment to compose herself. He began measuring and cutting pieces of wood to patch the holes, working with steady concentration. The sound of his labor was oddly soothing. The rasp of the saw, the tap of the hammer, the creak of wood settling into place. As the afternoon wore on, Helena found herself relaxing slightly. Yates worked without much talk, but when he did speak, it was to ask practical questions about the cabin or to explain what he was doing. He had a quiet competence about him that inspired confidence, and his presence made the cabin feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. When the light began to fade, Yates stepped back to examine his progress. He had patched the largest hole in the wall and reinforced several loose boards. The cabin already felt more solid, less like it might blow apart in the next strong wind. "That's good work for today," he said, collecting his tools. "I'll camp outside tonight and get back to it in the morning." "Wait," Helena said, the word escaping before she could think better of it. "You should eat something before you go. I don't have much, but I have some beans and cornbread." Yates hesitated, and Helena could see him weighing whether accepting would make her uncomfortable. "Only if you've got enough," he said finally. "I do." It was a small lie. Her supplies were running low, but she could not let this man work all day and then ride away without a warm meal. He had given her far more than she could repay with a plate of beans. She moved to the hearth and hung her small pot over the fire, adding beans and water from her dwindling supply. As she worked, she felt Yates watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a thoughtfulness that suggested he was reassessing the situation. "Mrs. Turner, do you have family nearby? Someone who can help you?" Helena shook the cornmeal into a bowl, her movements mechanical. "No. My husband died 2 months ago, cattle stampede." She heard Yates inhale sharply. "I'm sorry, that's a hard thing." "Yes." Helena did not trust herself to say more, "and the baby, due in February." She kept her eyes on her work, mixing the cornmeal with water and a pinch of precious salt. Yates was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "You can't stay here alone, not through the winter. Do you have money to get to family somewhere else?" Helena felt her fragile composure cracking. "I have no family. And no, I don't have enough money for passage anywhere. This cabin and 40 acres of rough land is all I have in the world." She heard Yates move, and then he was crouching beside her, his weathered face level with hers. "Then we'll make sure this cabin is solid and safe. You have my word on that." Helena looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity. This stranger, this cowboy who owed her nothing, was offering her hope when she had thought there was none left. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Yates reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed the tear from her cheek with a calloused thumb. The gesture was so gentle, so utterly without presumption, that it made her heart ache. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because you need help and I can provide it. That's reason enough." Helena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Yates stood and stepped back, giving her space, and she returned to her cooking with shaking hands. They ate in companionable silence, sitting by the fire as darkness fell outside. The beans were plain but filling, and the cornbread was a bit dry, but Yates ate without complaint. When they finished, he washed his plate and cup in the bucket of water by the door, then gathered his gear. "I'll be just outside if you need anything," he said. "Don't hesitate to call out if there's trouble. Thank you, Mr. Norwood." "Yates is fine, madam." Helena managed a small smile. "Then you should call me Helena," he nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Sleep well, Helena." After he left, Helena barred the door and banked the fire to last through the night. She lay down on her narrow bed, really just a wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress and her threadbare blankets, and listened to the sounds of Yates setting up camp outside. The clink of his gear, the low murmur as he spoke to his horse, the rustle of his bedroll. For the first time in weeks, Helena felt something other than despair. It was a fragile thing, barely more than a flicker, but it was there. Hope. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Confused, she pushed herself upright and saw sunlight streaming through the gaps in the walls, brighter than it had been in days because many of the gaps were smaller now. She wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and opened the door. Yates was crouched by a small fire he had built in a ring of stones, tending a skillet. He looked up when he heard the door and offered her a nod. "Morning. I've got coffee ready and some bacon." "Figured you could use a proper breakfast." Helena stared at him, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do that, I know, but I wanted to." He poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out to her. "Careful, it's hot." She accepted the cup with both hands, savoring the warmth that seeped into her palms. The coffee was strong and black, the way Thomas used to make it, and the first sip sent heat spreading through her chest. Yates handed her a plate with bacon and a piece of fried cornbread, and Helena sat on the porch step to eat. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The land stretched out endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional stand of trees along the creek and the distant shapes of grazing cattle. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. "Where are you from?" Helena asked, surprising herself with the question. "Born in Arkansas, but my family moved to Texas when I was 10. I've been working cattle since I was old enough to sit a horse." Yates took a sip of his coffee, his eyes on the horizon. "Spent the last year working on a ranch outside of Ogallala, but the owner sold out last month. I'm looking for a new outfit that needs hands for the winter." "You're not afraid of hard work, that's clear." He glanced at her and she saw a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Never have been. My pa always said that honest work was the backbone of a man's character. I try to live by that." "He sounds like a good man." "He was, died 3 years ago. Pneumonia took him fast." Yates's expression grew distant. "My ma still lives in Texas with my youngest sister. The middle one got married last year to a rancher near San Antonio. You must miss them. I do. But there's more opportunity up this way. I send money home when I can. He finished his coffee and stood, dumping the grounds on the fire. I should get back to work. That roof needs attention before the next rain. Helena watched as he climbed onto the roof with the agility of someone comfortable at heights. He moved carefully, testing each section to find the weak spots. Throughout the morning, she listened to him working above her head, removing damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones cut from a fallen tree he found by the creek. Helena tried to do her own work, mending a torn skirt and attempting to make the cabin more livable, but she found herself distracted by the man on her roof. There was something deeply reassuring about his presence, a sense of stability that she had not felt since Thomas died. By midday, Yates climbed down and stretched, working the kinks out of his shoulders. Roof's solid now, won't leak anymore. I don't know how to thank you, Helena said, and she meant it. The gratitude she felt was almost painful in its intensity. No thanks necessary. Yates picked up a bucket. I'm going to get water from the creek. Your supply's low. He made several trips, filling her barrels and buckets until she had more fresh water than she'd had in weeks. Then he turned his attention to the door, removing it from its failing hinges and planing down the edges so it would hang straight. He fashioned new hinges from strips of leather and metal fittings he carried in his pack, and when he rehung the door, it closed properly for the first time since Helena had arrived. As the afternoon progressed, Helena prepared a simple stew from the supplies she had left. Yates had disappeared into the prairie with his rifle, and she heard a single shot echoing across the grassland. He returned an hour later with a dressed jackrabbit, which he added to her pot without comment. You're a good shot, Helena observed. Have to be. Meat doesn't come to you out here. He washed his hands in the bucket and dried them on his bandana. There's decent hunting around here. You shouldn't have to worry about protein once the cabin's secure. I don't know how to hunt. Yates looked at her thoughtfully. I can teach you some basics before I leave. How to set snares, at least. That way you don't have to handle a rifle in your condition. The casual way he considered her future, making plans to ensure she could survive without him, made Helena's chest tighten. This man, who had been a stranger just yesterday, was doing more for her than anyone had since Thomas died. Over the next 3 days, Yates worked from sunrise to sunset. He repaired the walls, reinforcing them and filling every gap with proper chinking made from mud mixed with prairie grass and clay from the creek bed. He fixed the lean on the porch, strengthening the supports and replacing rotten boards. He mended the fence around what would be her garden come spring, and he dug out the well that had partially collapsed, shoring up the sides with stones. Helena watched him work and tried to help where she could, though he was quick to wave her off from anything too strenuous. Instead, she cooked their meals, washed his spare shirt when he changed into it, and listened to his stories of life on the trail. Yates told her about cattle drives and the vast herds that moved north from Texas to the railheads in Kansas and Nebraska. He described nights under the stars with nothing but the sound of lowing cattle and the songs of the cowboys to break the silence. He spoke of dust storms that blotted out the sun, rivers swollen with spring runoff that had to be crossed despite the danger, and the satisfaction of delivering a herd intact after months on the trail. In turn, Helena told him about her life in St. Louis, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had dreams of prosperity that never quite materialized. She spoke of her education in a small schoolhouse where she learned reading and arithmetic, and how she had met Thomas when he came to her father's store to buy supplies before heading west. He had been handsome and full of ambition, and she had been young and eager for adventure. Their courtship had been brief, and their marriage briefer still. "Did you love him?" Yates asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Helena considered the question carefully. "I cared for him, and I thought that was enough. He was kind to me, and he wanted to build a life together, but we barely had time to really know each other before he was gone." Yates nodded, staring into the flames. "That's the hard part of frontier life. Nothing's guaranteed. You can plan and work and dream, and then something happens and it's all gone." "Is that why you've never married?" Helena asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business. It's all right." Yates shifted, leaning back against the wall. "I've thought about it, but the life of a cowboy doesn't lend itself to settling down. I'm gone for months at a time on drives, and it wouldn't be fair to ask a woman to wait around not knowing if I'd come back. I've seen too many men leave wives and children behind when they didn't make it home." "But you want to eventually settle down, I mean. Someday. When I've got enough saved to buy my own place, maybe run a few head of cattle, have something real to offer." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "What about you? What do you want?" Helena placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "Right now, I just want to survive, to bring this baby into the world safely and give them a life. Beyond that, I don't know. I can't think that far ahead." "You're stronger than you think," Yates said quietly. "Not many women could handle what you're facing." Helena felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "I don't feel strong. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on. That's what strength is, holding on when everything tells you to let go." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them and the night sounds of the prairie drifting through the walls. Helena found herself studying Yates in the flickering light. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hands rested easy on his knees, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him. He was unlike any man she had known, entirely comfortable in this harsh land that terrified her. On the fourth day, Yates announced that the cabin was as secure as he could make it. He walked Helena through everything he had done, pointing out the reinforced walls, the solid roof, the door that closed tight against the wind. "This will hold you through the winter," he said. "Keep the fire going and you'll be warm enough. I've stacked enough wood to last you a month if you're careful with it, and I'll show you where to find more when you need it." Helena felt panic rising in her chest. "You're leaving?" "I need to get to Cheyenne before the snows come. If I wait much longer, I might not make it through." He saw her expression and his voice gentlened. "You'll be all right, Helena. You've got everything you need here." "Except I don't know how to survive on my own," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I don't know how to hunt or trap or any of the things I'll need to know." Yates was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll stay another few days and teach you what I can, but then I have to go." Those next days were bittersweet. Yates showed Helena how to set snares for rabbits and where to find edible plants that would supplement her diet. He taught her how to preserve meat by smoking it and how to recognize the signs of changing weather. He brought her into town in his wagon, introducing her to the shopkeeper and the other residents of Wood River, making sure people knew her situation so they might check on her through the winter. The townspeople were kind, offering advice and small gifts of food and supplies. The shopkeeper's wife, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, took Helena aside and gave her a bundle of baby clothes her own children had outgrown. "You come to town if you need help," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "We take care of our own out here, and you're one of us now." The words brought tears to Helena's eyes. She had felt so alone, but perhaps that had been partly her own doing. There were people here willing to help if she let them. On the ride back to the cabin, Helena sat beside Yates on the wagon seat and watched the prairie roll by. The land was beautiful in its starkness, The grass turned golden brown by the approaching winter, the sky an endless expanse of blue. "I'm going to miss you," she said quietly, not looking at him. Yates's hands tightened on the reins. "I'll miss you too. Will you come back? In the spring, maybe?" He was silent so long that Helena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I don't think that would be wise." Helena felt like she had been struck. "Why not?" Yates pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. His eyes were stormy, conflicted. "Because I'm starting to care about you, Helena. More than I should, given the circumstances. And that's not fair to either of us." Her breath caught. "What if I'm starting to care about you too? Your husband's barely been gone 2 months. You're grieving and vulnerable, and I won't take advantage of that." He reached out and touched her cheek, a brief, gentle contact. "You deserve better than a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name. You deserve stability and security, especially with the baby coming." "What if what I deserve is someone who's kind and decent, and who actually cares what happens to me?" Helena felt tears starting and blinked them back angrily. "What if I don't want you to go?" Yates closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Helena saw the same longing reflected there that she felt in her own heart. "Don't make this harder than it already is." He snapped the reins and the wagon started forward again, and Helena sat in miserable silence the rest of the way home. That night, Yates was distant, keeping his interactions with Helena brief and formal. He slept outside by his fire, and Helena lay awake in the cabin, one hand on her belly and her heart aching with a loss she had not expected. She had known this man for barely a week, and yet the thought of him leaving felt unbearable. The next morning, Yates packed his gear in grim silence. He checked the cabin one last time, making sure everything was secure, then led his horse from where it had been grazing. Helena stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, and watched him prepare to leave. The words she wanted to say tangled in her throat. "Please stay, please don't go, please give us a chance." But she could see the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes, and she knew nothing she said would change his mind. Yates swung into the saddle and sat there for a moment, looking down at her. "Take care of yourself, Helena, and the baby." Yates' eyes, she stopped, not knowing how to finish. He waited, but when she said nothing more, he nodded. "Goodbye, Helena." He turned his horse and rode away, and Helena watched until he was just a speck on the horizon. Then she went inside her cabin, closed the door that he had fixed, and let herself cry. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of Helena's life. The cabin was secure and warm, exactly as Yates had promised, but it felt empty without his presence. She went through the motions of survival, tending the fire, checking her snares, preparing meals. The baby grew inside her, increasingly active, and she talked to it sometimes, describing the world it would be born into and the man who had saved them both. November gave way to December, and the first real snow fell, blanketing the prairie in white. Helena watched it from her window, grateful for the solid walls and roof that kept her dry. She thought of Yates constantly, wondering if he had made it to Cheyenne, if he had found work, if he thought of her at all. One morning in mid-December, Helena woke to the sound of a horse outside. Her heart leapt with irrational hope, but when she looked out, it was only Mr. Patterson from town with a wagon load of supplies. "Morning, Mrs. Turner," he called cheerfully. "My wife sent me out to check on you and bring some things. Can't have you running short with winter settling in." Helena invited him inside and made coffee while he unloaded bags of flour, cornmeal, beans, and dried fruit. There was also a package wrapped in brown paper. "That's from Mrs. Patterson," he explained. "She wanted you to have it for Christmas." Helena opened it to find a beautiful knitted blanket, soft and warm, in shades of cream and blue. Tears sprang to her eyes at the kindness. Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "Now don't you cry, Mrs. Turner. My wife would have my hide if I made you upset." "These are happy tears," Helena assured him. "Please tell her thank you. Tell her I'm so grateful." After Mr. Patterson left, Helena wrapped herself in the new blanket and allowed herself to feel the warmth of community, of belonging. She was not as alone as she had thought. Christmas came and went quietly. Helena marked the day by reading from the small Bible that had been her mother's and cooking a special meal from her supplies. She thought of Yates and wondered where he was, what he was doing. She prayed he was warm and safe. The new year arrived, 1879, and with it came deeper cold and heavier snows. Helena's world shrank to the cabin and the immediate area around it. She checked her snares daily, grateful when she caught rabbits or the occasional prairie chicken. The skills Yates had taught her kept her fed. Her belly grew enormous, the baby pressing against her ribs and making sleep difficult. She felt ungainly and awkward, but also filled with anticipation. Soon she would meet this child, this piece of Thomas that would live on even though he had not. In late January, Helena woke in the night to find her nightgown soaked. For a moment she was confused, then realized with a start that her water had broken. The baby was coming a full month early. Panic seized her. She was alone, miles from town, with no one to help her through the birth. She struggled out of bed, breathing through a contraction that tightened her belly like an iron band. She needed help, but how could she get to town in her condition, in the middle of the night? Helena made it to the door and opened it, thinking wildly that she might harness Thomas's old plow horse and try to ride to town, but another contraction hit and drove her to her knees. The pain was intense, radiating from her back around to her front, and she cried out helplessly. Through the haze of pain, she heard something that made no sense, hoofbeats coming fast. She looked up and saw a rider approaching through the moonlit snow, and even in her distress she recognized the way he sat his horse. "Yates," she gasped, not believing her eyes. He was off his horse before it fully stopped, running to her and catching her as she swayed. "Helena, what's wrong? What's happening?" "The baby," she managed. "It's coming." His face went pale in the moonlight. "You're not due yet. Tell that to the baby." Another contraction hit and she gripped his arm hard enough to leave marks. "I'm scared, Yates. I don't know what to do." All right. Let's get you inside." He lifted her easily despite her bulk and carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her on the bed and immediately started building up the fire, his movements quick and efficient. "We need heat and light. Do you have clean sheets? Towels?" Helena pointed to the chest at the foot of the bed, and Yates began pulling out supplies. "I've helped birth calves and foals, but never a baby," he said, and she could hear the fear beneath his calm tone. "You're going to have to tell me what you need." "I don't know," Helena admitted. "I've never done this before either." Yates came to the bed and took her hand, his eyes locking with hers. "Then we'll figure it out together. You're not alone, Helena. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." "Why did you come back?" she asked, then cried out as another contraction seized her. "Because I couldn't stay away," he said simply. "Because I've been miserable every day since I left. Because I'm in love with you and I don't care if it's too soon or if it doesn't make sense. I had to come back." Helena wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that she loved him too, but the labor was intensifying. The contractions came faster and harder, each one stealing her breath and her ability to think. Yates stayed beside her, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Yates never left her side, never flinched away even when she screamed or dug her nails into his palm. He was a steady presence, An anchor in the storm, and Helena clung to him with everything she had. Finally, as dawn light began to filter through the window, the baby came. Yates caught the tiny, squalling infant in his hands, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "It's a boy," he said, his voice choked. "Helena, you have a son." He laid the baby on her chest, and Helena stared down at the impossibly small person who had been inside her. The baby had a shock of dark hair like Thomas and tiny, perfect features. He wailed loudly, announcing his displeasure with the cold world, and Helena felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Yates found a knife and cord, and with shaking hands, he did what needed to be done. He wrapped the baby in the soft blanket Mrs. Patterson had made and placed him back in Helena's arms, then cleaned up the aftermath of the birth with a matter-of-fact efficiency that belied his trembling hands. When everything was done, he sank into the chair beside the bed and dropped his head into his hands. "I thought I was going to lose you both," he said roughly. "I've never been so scared in my life. But we're all right," Helena said softly, "because you were here. You came back." Yates looked up and she saw tears tracking through the dust on his face. "I couldn't leave you. I tried, Helena. I got all the way to Cheyenne, found a good job on a ranch, but every night I lay awake thinking about you out here alone. When the new year came, I told my boss I had to go, and I rode straight back. I got here tonight and saw the cabin was dark except for a candle in the window, and I was just coming to check on you when you opened the door." "It's like fate," Helena whispered. "Maybe it is." Yates moved to sit on the edge of the bed, carefully avoiding jostling her. "I know this is complicated. I know you're still mourning Thomas and you just had his baby. But I meant what I said. I love you, Helena. I love you and I want to take care of you and this child if you'll let me." Helena looked down at her son, then back up at Yates. "I love Thomas in my way, but what I feel for you is different. It's stronger, deeper. You've shown me what it means to be truly cared for, not just as a wife or a responsibility, but as a person. I love you too, Yates. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you started repairing this cabin." Yates leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently. "Then we'll make this work. I'll find work nearby, close enough that I can come home every night. We'll be a family." "What about Cheyenne?" "There's ranch work all over Nebraska. I can find something closer to Wood River. And in time, maybe I can save enough to buy some land of our own, build our own herd." He touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and the infant gripped it reflexively. "I'll be a father to this boy if you'll let me. I'll raise him as my own." Helena felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I would be honored." They sat together as the sun rose, filling the cabin with golden light. The baby nursed for the first time, latching on with determined strength, and Helena marveled at the miracle of him. Yates watched them both with an expression of such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "What will you name him?" Yates asked. Helena had thought about names throughout her pregnancy, but now, looking at her son, only one felt right. "Thomas, after his father. Thomas Joseph Turner." Yates nodded. "It's a good name. He'll grow up knowing about the man who would have loved him." "And about the man who does love him," Helena added. "About the cowboy who repaired our broken cabin and made it safe, who came back when we needed him most." Over the following weeks, Yates stayed close, helping Helena recover from the birth and learning how to care for an infant. He proved surprisingly adept with little Thomas, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with the baby when he fussed. He built a proper cradle from wood he harvested and sanded smooth, and he fashioned toys from scraps of leather and cloth. In February, Yates rode into Wood River and found work on a ranch 10 miles from the cabin. The owner, a man named George Harrison, was expanding his operation and needed experienced hands. Yates proved his worth quickly, and Harrison offered him steady employment with decent wages. True to his word, Yates came home every evening. He would ride up as the sun was setting, his face tired but lighting up when he saw Helena and the baby. They would eat dinner together, and Yates would hold Thomas while Helena cleaned up, talking to the infant about his day and making up silly songs that made Helena laugh. As winter gave way to spring, their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. Helena felt stronger each day, her body recovering and her heart healing. She watched Yates with Thomas and fell more in love with him every time she saw the gentle way he handled her son. One evening in March, after they had put Thomas to bed in his cradle, Yates asked Helena to come outside with him. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead. He led her to the porch and stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking nervous. "I've been thinking," he began. "About us, about the future." Helena's heart began to beat faster. "What about it?" "I want to do this right. I want to marry you, Helena, but not until you're ready. Not until you've had time to mourn Thomas properly and you're sure this is what you want." He pulled a small object from his pocket and held it out to her. "This was my grandmother's ring. My mother gave it to me before I left Texas, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with." In the starlight, Helena could see the simple gold band with a small stone set in it. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a symbol of love and commitment. "I'm ready," Helena said softly. "Thomas will always be part of my past, and I'll always honor his memory. But you're my future, Yates. You and Thomas and whatever life we build together. I don't need more time. I know what I want, and it's you." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a deep, claiming kiss that spoke of promise and passion and permanence. Helena melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for the first time in so long she felt truly complete. They were married in April in the small church in Wood River, with the townspeople as witnesses. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears, and Mr. Patterson slapped Yates on the back, welcoming him to the community. Little Thomas slept through the ceremony in Mrs. Patterson's arms, oblivious to the life-changing event taking place. After the wedding, they returned to the cabin that Yates had repaired months ago. As they stood on the porch, Yates swept Helena into his arms, making her laugh in surprise. "What are you doing, carrying my bride over the threshold?" he said, grinning. He carried her inside and set her down gently. "Now it's yours and safe," he said, echoing the words he had spoken when he first finished the repairs. "This is our home, Helena, yours, mine, and Thomas's, and whatever children we might have in the future." Helena looked around the cabin, seeing not the broken-down structure she had been trapped in, but a real home filled with love and possibility. "It's perfect," she whispered. Their wedding night was gentle and unhurried. Yates treated Helena like she was precious, touching her with reverence and care. He made love to her slowly, learning her body, finding what pleased her. Helena had been with Thomas, but this was different, deeper, a joining of not just bodies but souls. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the narrow bed, Helena felt a peace she had never known before. The next months brought new challenges and joys. Yates worked hard at the Harrison Ranch, earning the respect of his employer and fellow cowboys. Mr. Harrison took a liking to him and began giving him more responsibility, eventually making him foreman. With his increased wages, Yates was able to buy supplies to improve their homestead. He built a proper barn for the horses and the cow he purchased, and he plowed and planted a large garden. Helena tended it carefully, growing vegetables that would sustain them through the next winter. Thomas grew rapidly, changing from a tiny newborn to a chubby, alert infant. He smiled and cooed, and when he was 6 months old, he said his first word, Dada, looking right at Yates. Helena watched her husband's face transform with emotion, and she knew she had made the right choice. Yates was Thomas's father in every way that mattered. In October, nearly a year after they had first met, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. She told Yates that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Already?" Yates asked, his eyes widening. Then a huge smile spread across his face. "Really? We're having a baby?" "Yes." Helena laughed at his excitement. "Are you happy?" "Happy? I'm over the moon." He pulled her into his arms and spun her around, careful not to jostle her too much. "Thomas is going to be a big brother." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in June of 1880, Helena gave birth to a daughter. The labor was easier this time, or perhaps it just seemed so because Yates was calm and confident, having been through it before. Their daughter had Yates's blue-gray eyes and a cap of light brown hair. "What should we name her?" Yates asked, cradling the tiny girl against his chest. Helena had thought long about this. "Rose, after your mother." Yates's eyes filled with tears. "You do that. Name her after my ma. Your mother raised a good man. I'd be honored to name our daughter after her." Rose Norwood completed their family in a way Helena had not realized was incomplete. Thomas, now a year and a half old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her gently and bring her his toys. Yates was besotted with his daughter, spending hours just watching her sleep or holding her while he told her stories about the ranch and the cattle. Life settled into a new rhythm. Yates continued to work for Mr. Harrison, but he was also saving every penny he could toward buying their own land. He had his eye on a parcel adjacent to their current homestead, good grazing land with a creek running through it. In the fall of 1881, Mr. Harrison called Yates into his office and made an unexpected offer. He was getting older and wanted to scale back his operation. He proposed selling Yates 100 acres at a price well below market value, with generous terms for payment. "You're the best foreman I've ever had," Harrison said. "I'd rather see this land go to someone who'll work it properly and treat it with respect. You've earned this, Yates." Yates came home that night barely able to contain his excitement. He swept Helena off her feet and kissed her soundly, then told her the news. "We'll have our own ranch," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our own land, our own herd. Everything I've dreamed about we can finally have." Helena felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "You deserve this. You've worked so hard." "We've worked hard," Yates corrected. "This is as much yours as mine, Helena. You've made a home for us, raised our children, managed this household. You're my partner in everything." They moved forward with the purchase, and by the end of the year, they officially owned 100 acres of Nebraska prairie. Yates bought a starter herd of cattle and began building the ranch that would be their legacy. The work was hard and the hours long, but they were happy. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch they had expanded, watching Thomas and Rose play in the yard while the sun set over their land. Yates would hold Helena's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and they would talk about their dreams for the future. In 1883, Helena gave birth to their second son, whom they named Henry. He was a robust baby with a loud cry and his father's determination. Thomas, now 4 years old, took his role as big brother seriously, helping Helena care for the younger children. The ranch prospered. Yates's skill with cattle and his honest dealings earned him respect throughout the region. Other ranchers sought his advice, and he became known as a fair and knowledgeable man. He hired a few hands to help with the growing herd, choosing carefully and treating his employees well. Helena became active in the community, helping to establish a school in Wood River so that children like Thomas and Rose could receive an education close to home. She also organized a women's group that met monthly to share skills and support one another through the challenges of frontier life. Mrs. Patterson became one of Helena's closest friends, and she often commented on how much Helena had changed from the frightened, shivering widow she had first met. "You were like a ghost when you first came to town," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon as they worked on a quilting project together. "Now look at you. You're one of the strongest women I know." Helena thought about that as she rode home that evening, her horse moving at an easy pace. Mrs. Patterson was right. She had changed, transformed by hardship and love into someone she barely recognized. The fearful woman who had huddled in a broken cabin, certain she would not survive, was gone. In her place was a wife, mother, rancher, and member of a thriving community. When she reached the ranch, she found Yates in the yard, teaching Thomas how to rope a fence post. The boy was concentrating fiercely, his tongue caught between his teeth just like his father when he focused on something. Rose sat nearby with a doll Helena had made her, having a serious conversation with it. Henry was napping in his cradle on the porch, visible through the open door. Yates looked up when he heard her horse and smiled, that open, genuine smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. He walked over to help her dismount, his hand steady on her waist as he lifted her down. "How was your visit?" he asked. "Good. Mrs. Patterson sends her regards." Helena leaned into him, savoring his warmth and solid presence. "How was your day?" "Better now that you're home." He kissed the top of her head. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd next spring. With cattle prices what they are, we could really increase our profit." They walked toward the house, hand in hand, discussing plans and dreams. Thomas ran up to show Helena his roping progress, and she praised him enthusiastically. Rose demanded attention, and Yates scooped her up, settling her on his shoulders as they entered the house. That night, after the children were in bed, Helena and Yates sat together on their bed, the lamp casting a warm glow over the room. The cabin had been expanded twice now, with separate rooms for the children and a proper bedroom for them. The walls were solid, the roof never leaked, and the windows were fitted with real glass. "You ever think about that first night I showed up?" Yates asked, pulling Helena against his side. "All the time," Helena admitted. "I was so frightened and so desperate, I couldn't see any way forward." And now, Helena looked around their bedroom, thought of their children sleeping safely, the thriving ranch outside, the community they were part of. "Now I can't imagine any other life. You gave me everything, Yates. You gave me hope when I had none, safety when I was vulnerable, and love when I thought I'd never feel it again." "You gave me purpose," Yates replied softly. "I was just drifting before I met you, working one job after another with no real direction. You and the children, this ranch, this life we've built together, it all means something. You mean everything to me, Helena." They made love slowly that night, a reaffirmation of the bond between them. Afterwards, as Helena drifted toward sleep in Yates's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Thomas's death had seemed like the end of everything, but it had actually been the beginning of her real life. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children and ranch. Thomas grew into a serious, hard-working boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the business of ranching. Rose was spirited and intelligent, insisting that her father teach her to ride and rope just like her brothers. Henry was the adventurous one, always getting into mischief and keeping Helena on her toes. In 1886, Helena gave birth to their fourth child, another daughter they named Grace. The cabin was definitely too small now, and Yates began work on a proper house. a two-story structure with enough bedrooms for their growing family, and a parlor where they could entertain guests. The house took nearly a year to complete, with Yates working on it whenever he had spare time. When it was finally finished, they had a celebration, inviting all their friends and neighbors. The house stood proud against the prairie sky, a testament to what hard work and determination could achieve. On the day they moved their belongings from the cabin to the house, Helena stood in the empty cabin one last time. So much had happened within these walls. She had nearly died here, given birth to Thomas here, fallen in love here, begun her real life here. Yates came to stand beside her. "Are you ready to leave it?" Helena nodded. "Yes, it served its purpose, but this," she gestured toward the new house, "this is our future." "What should we do with the cabin?" Helena thought for a moment. "Keep it, maintain it. Maybe someday one of our children will need it, or someone else might need shelter. It seems wrong to tear it down after everything it's seen." So the cabin remained, and over the years it did serve various purposes. It became a bunkhouse for ranch hands, a storage building, and once, shelter for a family passing through who needed a place to stay while their wagon wheel was repaired. Yates and Helena never charged them anything, remembering their own time of need. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. By 1890, Yates owned 500 acres and ran several hundred head of cattle. He employed a dozen men full-time and more during busy seasons. The Norwood Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the region. Thomas, now 12 years old, was already a skilled horseman and rancher. He had his father's steady temperament and his mother's intelligence. Rose, at 10, was as capable as any of the ranch hands, though Yates worried constantly about her taking unnecessary risks. Henry, at 7, was still getting into trouble regularly but showed promise with animals, able to gentle the most difficult horses. Grace, at 4, was the baby and thoroughly spoiled by her older siblings and parents alike. Helena sometimes looked at her family, gathered around the dinner table in their fine house, and could hardly believe this was her life. The frightened, pregnant widow who had shivered in a broken cabin seemed like another person entirely, someone from a half-remembered dream. One evening in late summer, as Helena and Yates sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset, Helena brought up something that had been on her mind. "I think we should tell Thomas about his birth father. Really tell him, I mean. He's old enough to understand now." Yates was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. He should know his full history." They called Thomas out that evening, and the three of them sat together as Helena told her eldest son about Thomas Turner, the man who had been his biological father. She spoke honestly about meeting Thomas, their brief marriage, his death, and her pregnancy. Then she told him about the day Yates had ridden up to her broken cabin and changed everything. Thomas listened intently, his young face serious. When Helena finished, he turned to Yates. "You're still my pa, that doesn't change." Yates's voice was rough with emotion. "You're my son in every way that matters, Thomas. I've loved you from the moment you were born, I know." Thomas stood and hugged Yates fiercely. "And I love you too, Pa." Helena wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son and husband embrace. This was what family meant. Not just blood, but choice and love and commitment. As the 1890s progressed, the Norwood family continued to thrive. The children grew and began to come into their own. Thomas started courting a girl from town, the daughter of the new banker. Rose announced she wanted to learn bookkeeping so she could help manage the ranch's finances. Henry discovered a talent for training horses. Grace began school and immediately became the teacher's favorite student. Yates and Helena grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative. Droughts that threatened their herd, harsh winters that tested their endurance, illnesses that frightened them but ultimately passed. Through it all, they remained partners, facing every challenge side by side. In 1895, Thomas married his sweetheart, Mary, in a beautiful ceremony at the church in Wood River. Helena cried happy tears as she watched her firstborn pledge his love, remembering the tiny infant she had brought into the world in that cold cabin with only Yates to help her. Yates built Thomas and Mary a house on the ranch property, a wedding gift that ensured the next generation would continue the legacy they had built. Within a year, Mary was pregnant, and in the spring of 1896, Helena became a grandmother for the first time. Holding her grandson, Helena was overwhelmed with emotion. She thought of the long journey from that desperate widow to this moment, grandmother, successful rancher's wife, respected member of the community. All of it had started with a cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger in need. One evening, as they celebrated the baby's arrival with a family dinner, Yates stood and raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he announced. "To family, both the one we're born into and the one we create, to second chances and new beginnings. And to my wife, Helena, who gave me the greatest gift of all, a life worth living." Helena felt tears streaming down her face as everyone clinked glasses. Rose leaned over and whispered, "Ma, you're crying again." "Happy tears," Helena said, just as she always did. "Always happy tears." The years continued their steady march. Rose eventually married a young lawyer from Omaha, though she insisted on maintaining her involvement in the ranch's business. Henry took over the ranch's horse breeding program and built it into a profitable side venture. Grace showed an interest in teaching and eventually opened a school on the ranch property for the children of their employees and neighboring families. Through it all, Yates and Helena remained the center of their growing family. They aged gracefully, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines that told stories of years lived fully. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by time and trials into something unbreakable. In 1900, they celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary with a party that included their 4 children, 3 grandchildren, and more friends and neighbors than could fit in their house. As Helena looked around at the celebration, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Later that night, alone in their bedroom, Yates pulled Helena into his arms. 21 years, he said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I first rode up to that cabin. And sometimes it feels like we've been together forever," Helena added. She traced the lines of his face with her fingertips, memorizing features she knew as well as her own. "I love you more now than I did then, which I wouldn't have thought possible." "I know what you mean." Yates kissed her softly. "You're my heart, Helena. You always have been." They made love with the ease of long familiarity, knowing exactly how to please each other, how to give and receive pleasure. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, horses moving in the corral, the distant call of an owl. "Do you have any regrets?" Helena asked quietly. "Not a single one." Yates's answer was immediate and firm. "Every choice I made led me to you in this life. How could I regret any of it?" Helena smiled in the darkness. "I used to think Thomas's death was the worst thing that could happen to me. But now I see that everything happens for a reason. If he hadn't died, I wouldn't have been in that cabin. You wouldn't have stopped to help. We wouldn't have found each other." "I believe we were meant to find each other," Yates said. "Maybe not the way it happened, but somehow, some way." "I believe that too." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and true. The new century brought changes to Nebraska and to the West in general. The wild frontier days were fading, replaced by towns with electric lights and telephones. The railroad expanded, making travel easier and bringing new opportunities. But some things remained constant: the land, the work, the importance of family and community. Yates began to slow down in his early 50s, though he would never admit it. Helena noticed him favoring his left knee, the result of being thrown from a horse years ago, and she saw how tired he was at the end of each day. She convinced him to let Thomas take on more of the daily ranch management, while Yates focused on the overall direction and business dealings. It was a difficult transition for Yates, who had always been a hands-on rancher, but he came to appreciate having more time to spend with Helena and their grandchildren. He taught the grandchildren to ride and rope, passing on skills and stories, becoming the wise patriarch of their growing family. In 1905, on a warm June evening, Yates and Helena sat on the porch of their house as they had done thousands of times before. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the prairie in breathtaking colors. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I've been thinking," Yates said, taking Helena's hand, "about that first night I saw you in the cabin doorway, shivering and afraid. That seems like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago. We've lived an entire life since then." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You were the bravest person I'd ever met, even if you didn't realize it. Facing the world alone, pregnant in a broken-down cabin. You could have given up, but you didn't." "I wanted to," Helena admitted. "Some days I wanted to just lie down and not get up again. But then I'd feel the baby move, and I'd remember that I had a reason to keep going. And I'm grateful every day that you did, that you held on until I found you." Yates pulled her closer, and Helena rested her head on his shoulder. "I repaired that cabin and told you it was yours and safe. I thought I was just fixing a building. But really, we were both broken, both in need of repair. We fixed each other, Helena." Tears slipped down Helena's cheeks. "Yes, yes, we did." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Their son Thomas came out of the house and smiled at them. "You two are still as in love as newlyweds," he said, shaking his head. "Always will be," Yates replied firmly. As darkness fell and the children were called inside, Yates and Helena remained on the porch a little longer. The prairie stretched out before them, their land, their legacy, the physical manifestation of everything they had built together. "Thank you," Helena whispered. "For what?" "For stopping that day, for caring about a stranger, for staying, for loving me and my son, for giving me this life." She gestured at the ranch, the house, everything around them, for all of it. Yates turned her face toward his and kissed her deeply. "Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me, for building this life with me, for every day of these 26 years. They went inside together, hand in hand, to the warm, welcoming home they had created. The old cabin still stood on the property, maintained and solid, a reminder of where they had started. But it was just a building now, a piece of history. Their real home was in each other's hearts, and it always would be. The years ahead would bring more joy and some sorrow, as life always does. There would be more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Yates and Helena would age together, their steps slowing but their love never faltering. They would sit on their porch on countless more evenings, watching sunsets and remembering. And when people asked them the secret to their long, happy marriage, they would always say the same thing. They had found each other when they both needed saving, and they had chosen each other every day since. Love, they believed, was not just a feeling but a decision, one they made over and over again. In the end, that old broken cabin represented something far more important than shelter from the cold. It represented hope in despair, kindness in hardship, and love finding a way even in the most unlikely circumstances. It represented a cowboy who stopped to help and a widow who dared to trust again. It represented the beginning of a great love story, one that would endure for decades and touch generations. And every time someone passed that old cabin, now weathered but still standing strong, they would remember the story of how Yates Norwood found Helena Turner shivering in the cold, repaired her broken shelter, and said, "Now it's yours and safe." They would remember how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that became legendary in Wood River, Nebraska. Because sometimes, when you fix what's broken, you discover that you yourself are being repaired. And sometimes, a stranger becomes family, a broken cabin becomes a home, and a moment of kindness becomes a lifetime of love. That was the legacy of Yates and Helena Norwood, written in the land they worked, the children they raised, and the love that sustained them through every triumph and trial. Their story became part of the fabric of Wood River, passed down through generations as an example of what it meant to help a neighbor, to choose love over fear, and to build something beautiful out of hardship. The cabin stood for many more years, a silent witness to the power of compassion and the transformative nature of love. And in the hearts of their descendants, the story lived on, of a pregnant widow who shivered in a broken cabin and the cowboy who repaired it and said, "Now it's yours and safe," not knowing that in saving her, he would find his own salvation. And together they would create a legacy that would endure far beyond their years on the Nebraska prairie.